Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Lightning Lunch session. Whether you're watching this live as we are streaming or you're watching a recording back at a later date, we hope you get a lot out of the session and explore the rest of the series of Lightning Lunch sessions that we're putting on. For those of you who are joining us live, just a few notes. So we are delivering the session today as a Zoom webinar. However, because it's a webinar, we can't see you, we can't hear you. You don't need to worry about your camera or your microphone. Also, we're recording this session, but you won't appear in the recording either, so don't worry about that. As we go along through the session, you are able to ask questions. We would encourage you to ask questions. So if you're watching live, use the Q&A button within Zoom, put your questions in there and we'll happily answer them towards the end. These can be put in anonymously as well. But if you're watching it back on the recording, if you have any questions about the program or the content of the session, you can email them in to us at outreach@ljmu.ac.uk. And if I can be any help, I will respond to you. And if it's related to the content of the session, I'll pass that on to our speakers and get you an answer to your question that way. So today's session is with Dr. Will Jackson and Dr. Helen Munn from our criminology team. And they're going to talk us through policing, gender and social order in the 21st century. So at this stage, I will stop sharing and invite Will and Helen to pop up.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Lightning Lunch session. As Chris has already said, my name is Dr. Helen Monk and I'm with my colleague, Dr. Will Jackson. And we're very quickly going to take you through briefly an introduction to what criminology is like at Liverpool John Moores, and that is very brief. And then we're going to do a taster session on gender policing and social order, just to give you a flavour of some of the stuff that you might study should you join us at LJMU. Thanks, Will. Okay, so what is criminology at Liverpool John Moores University? I think it's quite important when studying a criminology degree to really investigate the type of criminology that's taught at a particular institution. Criminology is an interdisciplinary subject, and so it can be taught from a social science perspective or from a legal perspective or a combination of both. So it's always good to get this information. At LJMU, we take a critical exploration to the institutions of criminal justice. And so this is something that's quite standard across all criminology programs. We will explore the significant institutions of the criminal justice system. So things such as policing, the prison system, the court system, sentencing, various points throughout kind of the criminal justice system process. But importantly for us, we also want to look at the way that those institutions function and the impacts that they have on wider society and on individuals. So we think beyond the criminal justice system as a discrete set of institutions, and we really try to explore the impacts that crime itself, but also those institutions have on broader understandings of criminalisation, victimisation, and social harm. So we take what we call a critical approach or a critical perspective towards criminology and the different institutions that make up the criminal justice system. One of the reasons that we do this is because we wish to scrutinise the effectiveness of responses to the problem of crime. Do we really understand what crime is, and do we approach it and tackle it in the most effective way? So this is trying to unpick some of the dominant understandings around what we think about crime and potential criminals and the harm that that has on society, but also to really bring into sharp focus the idea of social divisions and power. Who is criminalised? Who do we think of as criminal? Who, in a sense around social divisions, is really impacted by the idea of social harms? For example, if we think about the idea of drug taking and drug policy, is that a criminal justice issue or is it a health issue? Is it an issue that's brought to bear on certain communities? Are people, as we will look at today, policed in particular ways because of their identity and their social location? So essentially what I'm saying is criminology at LJMU is very much based on a social science and kind of critical perspective, and we try to ask pertinent questions about the concept of crime and the wider kind of net effects that it has on society and particular communities and groups of people. Thanks, Will. What we're going to do today is just to give you a snapshot of some of those, the ways that we could approach some of those questions in the context of understanding gender and policing and the relationship between those two things. So from a social science perspective and a critical criminological perspective, we would understand gender in a certain way. And I'm just going to take you through that kind of social science perspective of how we understand gender, and then will unpack those ideas in the context of policing. So we would think of gender as being socially constructed, and this might be a reasonably familiar concept to you if you've done any kind of sociology or sociology of deviance or any sort of gender studies before then. So we would say that it's a verb and not a noun, in that we wouldn't understand gender to be a fixed identity or a fixed set of prescriptions, but something that is active, that we perform, as Judith Butler says, that we perform our gender. We are active in its conceptualization. We are doing gender. It is not kind of inscribed onto us. And because of that performative nature and gender as a fluid and dynamic concept, we can think about it as having also principles that can formalize and codify the way that society is structured. If we understand gender, as Rueen Connell suggests, as part of a gender order, we can think about the ways in which our own gender and the gender of other people formulate part of a social structure. Connell talks about the idea of gender relations, so relations that you might have between yourself and other people, or even with yourself in terms of subjectivity. But importantly, she talks about gender in terms of operating at an institutional level. So, for example, the idea of the family could be very much viewed as a gendered institution. And then further up than that, existing on a structural level as part of a gendered order. And you can see the quote that's on the slide here. We can understand the gender order as a historically constructed pattern of power relations between men and women and definitions of femininity and masculinity. And therefore, we can talk about gendered inequalities or gendered experiences as existing on a structural level, much the same as you may have seen in contemporary debates around race and racism, that these things exist on structural levels as well as individual levels. And therefore, gender is able to be organised along patriarchal lines, patriarchy relying on a system of society in which men hold power and women don't, essentially. And one of the ways that we would kind of use this understanding of gender in relationship to criminology, into understanding the relationship between gender and crime and victimisation, is to think about how gender is reproduced through institutions of the criminal justice system. And we could think about the ways in which criminal justice institutions operate and respond to people and form part of that idea of a reproduction of the gendered social order. And we would like to offer the policing of women as one way in which we can understand how gender is reproduced through the criminal justice system.
Brilliant. Right. Thanks, Helen. So one of the things that we would do as part of our approach to criminology, as Helen has said, is that we would study those institutions of the criminal justice system, and policing is a central concern for all criminology courses. But one of the ways in which we approach this is to think about the historical development of policing as an institution, but also connected to a wider set of social practices. So when we think about the relationship between policing and gender, and particularly in that regard, we think about women's experiences of policing. I mean, one of the starting points might be to look at the prison population as it's currently configured in England and Wales and say, well, actually, this isn't really an area of major concern for criminologists. I think the current prison population as of the end of April was about 4% women. The vast majority of people who end up in our criminal justice system are men. Well, in that sense, that reinforces where we've started from in this session, that gender is important. We do need to think about gender as a factor as criminologists. But I think even though there is relatively few women in our prison system, women's experiences in the criminal justice system are particularly important. And while we might say that women as a group in society experience the formal institution of policing less than men, particularly as offenders, there's a whole set of experiences that we need to make sense of if we are interested as criminologists in the making of laws, the breaking of laws, and the response to those who break the law. So we know through kind of pioneering work that was done in the 1970s, particularly in the 1980s, that women's experiences of policing, particularly as victims, were and continue to be really problematic. There are well documented in a range of kind of analyses of policing that look quite old at this point, but still have an impact on our discipline, that police attitudes towards women as victims had an effect on their experiences and the justice ultimately that they received. And what the work of, say, Susan Edwards, Robert Reiner, Jalna Hamner were able to demonstrate to us was that historically the police had viewed violence against women as quite different to violence in other contexts. And there was a sort of well-documented set of ideas that domestic violence and responding to domestic violence was not real police work. So what this kind of foundational work in criminology demonstrated to us was that there was a set of attitudes related to broader perceptions of gender and gendered roles, which impacted upon policing and particularly impacted women within this particular setting. And we also know through, again, really important criminological research that there has been significant change made in the intervening decades. And one of the things that's really had a really important effect on policing really over the last century is the role of women in police, and particularly in key roles within policing in the UK, to change the police response. So we have seen major changes in police policy and practice, very often driven by women in a range of positions in the police force that have sought to rectify some of those fundamental problems in the way that the police were failing to respond to domestic violence. However, we know from relatively recent findings from the Inspectorate of Constabulary that there are continued failings in the police response to domestic violence and sexual violence in particular. And that recent findings from those organisations responsible for the oversight of policing in the UK have suggested that there remain to be poor attitudes and problems with the way that police are trained and the way that they respond to this particular area of policing. So if we're criminologists interested in what the police do, if we're social scientists, as Helen suggested, concerned with the relationship between the institutions of criminal justice and society more generally, then this seems like an area that we need to take seriously. One of the things that we're doing then as criminologists is thinking historically. We're trying to understand how those institutions of criminal justice have evolved and changed, but we're also thinking about historical continuities. What remains the same and where are those problems that still occupy criminological researchers and those institutions and organizations responsible for reforming criminal justice? So we look at what the police do, but we also look at the connections that has with wider problems in the criminal justice system. Now, the work of Jan Jordan, who a criminologist looking particularly at police responses to rape and sexual violence, has suggested that there are enduring attitudes within the police organisation that reflect wider societal beliefs, as well as particular institutional cultures, practices, and influences. So this is research that is reflected in countries around the world, that we understand from the sort of founding principles of policing that the police are the people and the people are the police. So if we have a set of problematic attitudes within society more generally, then it would be reasonable to assume that they are in existence in the police. And one of the things that criminologists concerned with policy reform seek to do is to think about strategies for transformation of those ideas reflected in policing that would hopefully improve the experiences of those who come into contact. And a final point then, one of the things that we are interested in as researchers is the way in which certain groups in society have differential experiences of the police particularly, and also the wider criminal justice system. So while we're thinking here about gender, what we would continue to do is to think about the ways in which gender intersects with issues of age, ethnicity, sexuality, and to try and understand why certain groups of women have historically and arguably continue to be rendered invisible in criminological work, but also in the way that policing as an institution has sought to change its approach. So if we think historically, and we will bring this into the 21st century and give you a sense of what criminologists are seeking to consider today, we can think about the police response to women as victims, but also, while we can concede that the number of women who end up in our prison system is relatively small, women's experiences as suspects and offenders are also important for us to try and make sense of. So one of the areas in which women historically have come into contact with police is in forms of protest. And I include the picture on the slide there because actually some of the kind of technologies and techniques of modern policing that we see as sort of standard practice now around photography and surveillance, for example, were actually developed in response to the suffragettes in the late 19th and early 20th century. So the particular response to what we could refer to as disorderly women has long occupied the police institution in this country and elsewhere around the world. So we could argue then that women on protest, and the suffragettes being the kind of most explicit example of this in the early sort of stages of modern policing, these women were marked as being out of place. They were essentially challenging the natural role of women. And Helen referred previously to the family as an institution, as a gendered institution that reproduces ideas of gendered roles. Well, what we're looking at here is the connection between the institutions of the criminal justice system and wider kind of social institutions. So again, to try and think about policing in the abstract, to try and think about it isolated from the wider social and political context within which it operates is very difficult and something that our approach to criminology would warn against. So we know that women's experience of policing is less frequent, is less formal than men, but it is distinct. And as criminologists and criminological researchers, we have an obligation, I think, to try and make sense of those distinct experiences and to think about how they are changing and how they could be changed in the future. So we have seen in recent decades what we could refer to as an increasingly formal mode of policing of gendered norms, and research done in the US, as well as research done in Canada, Australia, and other parts of Europe has suggested that women's experience of the criminal justice system has shifted and changed and developed in a way that we need to keep pace with as criminologists. We need to understand what is happening outside the window, and we need to continue to be engaged with those who are working in, but also have experience of the criminal justice system. One of the things that feminist criminologists have pointed to for some decades now is to think about the particular experiences of those women who come into contact with the criminal justice system, into contact with policing, and particularly those who end up in the prison system, is that very often those women who are criminalized are also those with significant experience of victimization as well. So as criminologists, again, we're interested in those three processes: the making of laws, the breaking of laws, and the response to those who break the law. But we need to make sense of the overlap between the groups who are criminalized and the groups who are victimized. And particularly when we look at women's experiences, that overlap is something that we really need to try and make sense of in a way that I don't quite think we're there. So why would we think about policing and gender? Well, as we've moved into the 21st century, there has been something of a rediscovery of girls' or women's violence, and and a fascination with women as offenders. You know, if we look at the kind of true crime documentaries that are made, and there is a kind of phenomenal number of these now, the expansion of true crime podcasts, there is a kind of real fascination, particularly with women's offending, and a perception that something has shifted, particularly in the 21st century. We can relate this to panics, moral panics around binge drinking, for example, and an apparent shift in women's behavior. One of the things that we need to do as criminologists is to really take to task those ideas of a substantive shift in women's behavior, but to think about how those perceptions map onto changes in criminal justice policy and practice. So what we tried to do there in that the kind of middle part of that session is to suggest that as criminologists, we need to think historically. That doesn't mean we only think about the history of these things, but to make sense of where we are now, we need to think historically. And this is part of our approach to criminology that has been referred to as a rendezvous discipline. And what we mean by that is that to think as a criminologist, we need to draw upon insights from a range of different subjects. And I made the point here that we need to think as historians. I mean, Helen's made the point that we are thinking as social scientists, we're thinking as sociologists. And at various points in a criminology degree, you would be drawing upon insights from political theory, from philosophy, from geography, from economics, again, to try and make sense of the bits that fit within our fairly narrow focus, the making of laws, breaking of laws, and response to those who break the law, as I keep saying, but to try and understand that in a much wider context. So where we're at now, and this is work that Helen and I are kind of occupied with as researchers, is to think about the contemporary relationship, the 21st century relationship between policing and gender, and particularly here to think about women's experiences of policing, both as victims and as offenders. And the kind of fundamental questions for us in terms of why we do the research that we do is to think, well, what needs to change? So it isn't a case of saying everything is just as it was in the early 20th century or in the post-war period or the 1980s. We're interested in how things change, but also where the problems remain. Now, one of the things that the police, senior police officers in this country have recognized, and this is in recent months, is that the way the police respond to rape and sexual violence in particular still requires fundamental change. Now, we have had in the last 20 years major changes to the law on sexual violence. We see the Sexual Offences Act back in 2003. There has been significant change to police policy. And research would suggest in places there has been major change to what the police actually do. But there remain these major problems. When we look at the number of rape cases which are reported to the police, we've got our first major obstacle in that the majority of cases never come to the attention of the police. So one of the things we have to think about in doing our research, getting out and talking to people, which is often how we would do our work, is to think, well, why do people feel, particularly why do women as victims of sexual violence feel that they can't go and report to the police? Where are the barriers? Where are the obstacles? Are they in the perceptions of the police? Are they reflected in the reality? Do we have what's often referred to as a sort of postcode lottery within England and Wales with the nature of the response that women receive from the police? So one of the things that criminologists are occupied with thinking through is the nature of those changes that would be needed. What has changed so far? What still needs to be done? Are we heading in the right direction? This is something which has been well documented in recent years, that sexual violence victims have been identified as being failed by police. So that radical change that we see there is a reflection of the enduring failing of police to deal effectively with the nature and extent of sexual violence in this country. And one of the things that we need to do as criminologists is think in a comparative sense, to think about, well, what's happening elsewhere in the world? And sadly, we see direct comparisons in this kind of enduring failure to take this type of crime seriously. So we need to look at what's happening elsewhere. We need to draw upon examples of good practice, but we also need to think about why may there be similar failings elsewhere in the world. Does this come back to our broader attitudes towards gender and particularly towards sexual violence? So one of the things that we've pointed towards, and one of the things that is being done in criminological research, one of the things that we want our students to think about is, how do communities in our society relate to institutions of criminal justice? And the most explicit one there, the most important one really, that most people would come into contact with is the police force. So is there a problem with trust in the police with particular communities? And one of the things we're interested in here is, do police attitudes towards women, and when I'm talking about police attitudes, I don't mean every single police officer, but we mean the institutional approach to women. Does that present a barrier to effective engagement? So when we look at recent high-profile examples that maybe are connected to that lack of trust, we have seen in recent years, particularly in the last 10 years, revelations about undercover policing in this country and the deployment of undercover police officers to survey a range of social movements, political movements, and justice campaigns. And as part of that, we've seen very high-profile media coverage of women's experiences of male officers being deployed, forming romantic sexual relations, and then disappearing. And that group of women who are part of the judicial inquiry that is ongoing into this have described themselves as being victims of a coordinated rape by police officers. And these are incredibly serious allegations about the way that the institution of policing in this country has operated. So one of the things that we seek to do as criminologists is to tackle, to make sense of, to research and explore the issues which are being debated and discussed today. So when we look at the recent news reports about sexual abuse claims by police officers, we have to think, well, how would we make sense of this? How would we understand it? And then what would we do about it? So to try and come all the way back to where Helen started the lecture, what we're interested in is understanding the fundamental problems that affect our institutions of criminal justice, understanding the experiences of communities who engage with the criminal justice system, but then also thinking, well, what would we do about it? It's not an approach of just pointing at problems, although that's an important part of what we do as criminologists. But what we're also seeking to do through engagement with communities around the country is to think, well, what needs to change, and how might we imagine a criminal justice system that works differently in the future? So I hope that's been of some interest. I hope it's perhaps been of some use. I would hope to see that those of you doing sociology at A-level could see where we're picking up on a number of different threads that are there in your syllabus at the moment, particularly in the crime and deviance aspect of the A-level syllabus, and see how we're able to develop those. And the final point, I suppose, one of the things that we're trying to do as a criminology team is to bring people in who are interested in these topics, but give you the requisite research skills to be able to go and do your own research in areas of criminological significance that you're particularly interested in. So thanks very much for listening to that, either if you're listening to us as we talk or you're catching up later. And if there's any questions, Helen and I have been more than happy to answer them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen and Will. That was it's really fascinating. It's interesting, isn't it, to see how much things have changed and yet how far they still have to go. And I'm sure that will be of real interest to prospective students to the university in topics like criminology and sociology, as you've said. I'm just going to go back to share a slide myself. So I can see we haven't had any questions come in as we've been recording live. But as I said at the beginning, if you are watching this back, please take the opportunity to get in touch with us if there's anything you would like to discuss. So we hope you have found today's webinar useful. If you're interested in the rest of the series of lightning lunch sessions, you can find them on our website. There is quite a wordy link on screen now. If you go to the website and search for lightning lunch sessions, I'm sure you'll find them. We also have a new webpage set up for students, which is our Moving Forward microsite. Again, it might be easiest to just search for that, but that contains lots of information, including how the university is responding to COVID-19 and things like that. So, as I said before, any questions that you want to ask after you've watched back the recording, email them to outreach@ljmu.ac.uk. They will come in to me, and if I am able to help, then I will. But what's more likely is I will pass on your questions to Helen and Will, and we'll get you a response that way. But thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today. And as I said before, I hope everyone has enjoyed the session, and we'll see you on future events with Liverpool John Moores University soon.